Would you take on a Japanese armoured cruiser with a Lewis machine gun? Well, with a cry of "Get off my bloody ship!" That's exactly what the captain of a small Royal Navy gunboat, HMS Peterel, did in China in 1941. Just a few hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the British crew were fighting for their lives as the Japanese overran the international settlement in Shanghai. So sit back as I explain how HMS Peterel ever ended up in this one-sided fight, why they were in Shanghai in the first place, and what happened next. This is the story of the Royal Navy's defiant last stand in Shanghai in 1941. Before we get stuck into this brave against the odds battle, I want to explain why HMS Peterel was in Shanghai in the first place. Following the British victory in the First Opium War in the 1840s, China was forced to open 5 treaty ports to foreign trade. One of those 5 was Shanghai. The British established a settlement just to the north of the Chinese town in 1843, swiftly followed by the Americans and the French, who established their own concessions north and south of the British area respectively. In 1854, the three nations created the Shanghai Municipal Council, the SMC, to manage shared services. And whilst the French withdrew from this arrangement in 1862, the British and American settlements formally merged to create the Shanghai International Settlement. Unlike Hong Kong, the international settlement was never a colony of Britain or indeed anyone else. Under the system of extraterritoriality, foreign nationals were exempt from Chinese law and subject only to their own consular courts. And so this enclave was a bit of an anomaly, technically part of China, but under foreign management. A bit like a perfume concession in a department store. The settlement maintained its own fire service, police force, the Shanghai Municipal Police, and military reserve, the Shanghai Volunteer Corps. It became a tiny replica of the West in the growing Chinese city. The waterfront area, known as the Bund, became the Wall Street of Asia, lined with grand European-style buildings, housing banks and trading houses. As more nations entered into treaty relations with China during the 19th century, their nationals joined the settlement's administration. By the 1930s, 14 treaty powers were represented, including the United Kingdom, the United States and France, but also Japan, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain and even Peru. The international character was reflected in the municipal flag and seal, which featured the flags of many of those nations. By 1932, Shanghai was home to some 70,000 foreigners and close on 3 million Chinese. And nearly half of those Europeans were white Russians who had fled from the Bolshevik Revolution. During the 1930s, there was also a new influx of arrivals. Something like 30,000 German Jews fleeing Nazi persecution arrived in the international settlement, drawn by its lack of visa requirements. Throughout its existence, the settlement's municipal council remained predominantly a British affair. British residents held the largest number of council seats and headed all municipal departments, except the orchestra, which was controlled by an Italian. Many of the nations holding concessions in Shanghai also maintained a military presence there to protect their interests. Historically, the largest contingents came from Britain and the United States. Both countries also maintained small naval forces on the Yangtze River to protect their commercial interests and nationals deeper into China. The Royal Navy's China station included the Yangtze Flotilla, comprising river gunboats, specially designed for the shallow waters and long reaches of the river. The American equivalent was the Yangtze River Patrol. They were a very visible face of gunboat diplomacy in China. But this dominance by Britain, the Americans and others too, was about to be challenged. Japan and China had been engaged in a sporadic conflict since 1931, when Japan had seized Manchuria. Full-scale war erupted in July 1937, and within weeks, fighting spread to Shanghai. The Battle of Shanghai, a brutal urban engagement, ended in December 1937, with the Japanese controlling the whole city, except for the international settlement. The Municipal Council declared its neutrality in the ongoing Sino-Japanese War, and for their part, the Japanese respected the extraterritorial status of the international settlement, and also the French concession. For the next 4 years, a slightly bizarre situation of a European and American-controlled part of Shanghai got on with business as usual, whilst being surrounded by Japanese forces. American Marines and British troops maintained an uneasy presence alongside Japanese forces in this neutral zone. But the outbreak of war in Europe in September 1939 shifted Britain's strategic priorities dramatically. Royal Navy warships based in Shanghai, such as the light cruiser HMS Birmingham, were recalled to home waters or sent to the Mediterranean. Apart from a few Yangtze gunboats, the only British military presence in the international settlement were the 2nd Battalion, East Surrey Regiment, and the 1st Battalion, Seaforth Highlanders. Both battalions had arrived in Shanghai in 1938, the Seaforths in March, having previously been stationed in Hong Kong and Palestine before that, and the East Surreys arriving in the September. By August 1940, even these two battalions were withdrawn to Malaya, where the East Surreys would be captured at the fall of Singapore. The 1st Battalion Seaforths managed to escape that fate, having been moved on to India. That left just 1,200 men from the US 4th Marines as the only protection for the international settlement. And as tensions between the United States and Japan increased during late 1941, Washington decided that they were too vulnerable and too small to hold the international settlement. At the end of November, the 4th US Marines were evacuated, and the USS Luzon led all but one of the remaining American gunboats towards the Philippines. All that was left for any sort of military presence was the USS Wake, considered too small to survive the journey to the Philippines, and the Royal Navy gunboat, HMS Peterel. HMS Peterel was a river gunboat built by Yarrow shipbuilders on the River Clyde, Scotland, and launched on the 18th of July 1927. She was the 6th Royal Navy ship to carry the name. After completion in 1928, the ship was disassembled and shipped to Hong Kong for reassembly before being deployed with the Yangtze Flotilla. Displacing 310 tons, the 186-foot Peterel was designed specifically for operations on the Yangtze. Her shallow 3-foot draft enabled her to patrol the upper reaches of the river, while her primary armament of 2 3-inch guns and 8 machine guns provided adequate firepower for her protection duties. Now in December 1941, Peterel remained in Shanghai to provide a token British military presence and a symbolic discouragement to Japanese aggression against the international settlement. Her crew was reduced from 55 to just over 20 British sailors, plus 19 locally recruited Chinese. With such a reduced complement, she could steam for only limited periods. More significantly, her main armament had been deliberately disabled. The breech blocks of her 3-inch guns had been removed and taken to the Royal Navy dockyard in Hong Kong, lessening her value to the Japanese should she be captured. Her captain was Lieutenant Stephen Polkinghorn, a 62-year-old New Zealander originally from Lancashire, serving in the Royal Navy Reserve. As a merchant officer in peacetime, he had been plying the seas and waterways around China since the end of the First World War. He was under orders to scuttle the vessel should the Japanese attack. The ship was fully rigged with demolition charges in preparation for this eventuality. But just because Polkinghorn was a reservist didn't mean that he didn't inherit a bit of the spirit of Nelson, as you're going to find out very shortly. Just downstream from the Peterel was the last remaining American gunboat, USS Wake. Rather like her British counterpart, she was a token gesture to the residents of the international settlement, and to the surrounding Japanese. Originally launched as USS Guam here in Shanghai in 1927, She was renamed Wake earlier in 1941, as Guam was needed for a new, larger cruiser being built in the United States. Displacing 350 tons, so slightly bigger than Peterel, Wake normally carried a crew of 59 and was armed with 2 3-inch guns and 8 30 caliber machine guns. When at the end of November 1941 the rest of the American ships had sailed to Manila in the Philippines, Columbus Darwin Smith, an experienced China hand who'd been piloting riverboats on the Yangtze, was asked to accept a commission and appointed captain with the rank of Lieutenant Commander. Smith had actually served in World War I, where he had received the Navy Cross. USS Wake was reduced to a skeleton crew of just 14 and ordered to simply intercept Japanese signals. By December 1941, the international settlement had survived 4 years as an increasingly precarious island of neutrality. Japanese troops conducted exercises near the settlement's boundary, whilst the Japanese Navy dominated the riverfront. Moored close to HMS Peterel and USS Wake was the cruiser Izumo, a veteran of the Battle of Tsushima against the Russians in 1905. A further Japanese gunboat was moored just downstream. If, or surely it was when, the Japanese attacked, it really wouldn't be a contest. And by December 1941, the sands of time were running out for the international settlement. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese launched their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Because of the international dateline, it was already the 8th of December in Shanghai. The attack on the US Pacific Fleet began at 7:48 AM Hawaiian time. That was 1:18 AM on the 8th of December in Shanghai. During the night, the Japanese cruiser Izumo, ironically constructed by Armstrong Whitworth and launched on the River Tyne in 1899, trained her guns on the British gunboat. Polkinghorn wasn't unduly alarmed. The Japanese had been increasing this sort of threatening behaviour for several months. At around 4:20 AM local time, some 2 hours after the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, word began filtering through to the city. The British consulate immediately notified HMS Peterel to expect a visit from the Japanese very soon. Considering the futility of their position, the consulate also advised the gunboat to strike her colours and avoid loss of life. But that was not in Polkinghorn's nature. He now sounded the action station's alarm and his men took up position behind sandbags on the decks. As no hostile action had yet taken place, Polkinghorn did, however, decide not to scuttle his ship. Maybe he should have. But on the other hand, as hostilities hadn't actually broken out, he was in danger of scuttling his ship in peacetime. Not something Royal Navy captains are in the habit of doing. Of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but caught in his situation, I wonder what we would have done. Decision made, Polkinghorn and his crew of 18 now waited. Meanwhile, just a little way down the river, the captain and crew of USS Wake were not even aware of the attack on their fleet at Pearl Harbor. Indeed, Lieutenant Commander Columbus Smith was actually ashore when at 4 AM a launch carrying Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops, their version of Marines, approached the American gunboat. Surprised and overwhelmed before they could react, Wake's skeleton crew of 14 men was captured without a shot being fired. When Smith arrived at the quayside, he too was taken prisoner. USS Wake thus became the only United States Navy vessel to surrender to the enemy during the entire Second World War. The Japanese renamed her Tatara and commissioned her into their navy. She was subsequently given to the Japanese puppet reorganised National Government of China, based in Nanjing. Now a launch full of Japanese Marines appeared out of the darkness and came alongside HMS Peterel. Captain Otani Inaho, through an interpreter, requested permission to come aboard. Polkinghorn, aware of Pearl Harbor but still not 100% sure how this was going to play out in Shanghai, agreed. It was now approximately 4:20 AM. Captain Otani informed him that a state of war now existed between Britain and Japan and commanded the surrender of the ship. Polkinghorn tried to stall for time so that his codebooks could be sent down a special chute to be burned in the boiler room. Time also to set the demolition fuses. He therefore invited the Japanese officers to come below decks to discuss matters. They refused, curtly repeating their demand that he surrender immediately. After all, they said, resistance in the face of the nearby armoured cruiser was futile. Pulling himself up to his full height, Polkinghorn jutted out his chin towards Captain Otani and snapped, "Get off my bloody ship!" Somewhat taken aback, the Japanese officers bowed politely and returned to their launch. It was now about 5 a.m. The Japanese boat pulled away about 300 feet, and then Captain Otani fired a very pistol flare into the air. Immediately, all hell broke loose. The Japanese forces had clearly planned for this contingency, with guns pre-trained on Peterel awaiting the signal. The cruiser Izumo opened fire with her 4 8-inch guns and 8 6-inch guns at almost point-blank range, her searchlights illuminating the British gunboat. The Japanese gunboat downstream also joined in, as did artillery batteries on the Bund and at Putang Point on the opposite side of the river. Facing this overwhelming bombardment, Peterel's position was hopeless. Not that it would have made much of a difference, but remember, his own guns had previously been disabled. Her crew, however, were not prepared to go down without a fight. Arming themselves with small arms and even naval cutlasses, like something out of Nelson's day, they prepared to repel any boarders. And then 21-year-old able seaman James Jim Mariner opened up with a deck-mounted Lewis gun. He raked the Japanese motor launch, killing several of its occupants, and would later be recognised as the first British serviceman to fire on Japanese forces during the Second World War. But it really was a one-sided battle. Years later, Mariner recalled, "It was dreadful. The noise was shocking. They were at point-blank range and they blew us to smithereens. I never thought I'd get out alive." He remembered a Chinese crewman next to him having his head blown off. The unequal contest could not last long. Under the devastating bombardment, Peterel caught fire, capsized, and drifted from her mooring. Slowly she sank, aided by the detonation of her explosives, her white ensign still flying. She was the first Royal Navy ship to be sunk by the Japanese in the Second World War. Polkinghorn now gave the order to abandon ship. Those still alive got into the motor launch that had been readied and pushed off, making for the shore. But the Japanese had not finished. Lieutenant Commander Columbus Smith, the captured captain of USS Wake, witnessed what followed from the shore. Jets of water sprung up around the fleeing boat, and then a shell struck it directly. The little motor launch burst into flames and capsized. As desperate survivors swam for the shore, lit up by searchlights and the burning British gunboat, small spurts of water appeared around their bobbing heads. Japanese troops were firing on the struggling sailors with their rifles. And then, in a moment that could almost have come out of a film or a movie for my American viewers, a small armada of sampans crewed by Chinese civilians appeared on the water, attempting to pick up survivors. Some were taken to the bank of the river, where other civilians, both Chinese and British, helped them through the thick mud. One wounded sailor was too weak to pull himself into a rescue vessel and was simply dragged through the water to a neutral Panamanian freighter moored nearby. That sailor was Polkinghorn himself, one finger almost severed and with shrapnel lodged in his backside. But if he and some of his crew thought they'd reached safety on a neutral ship, they were sadly wrong. Despite the protests of the ship's Norwegian captain, Japanese Marines now stormed aboard and took the survivors prisoner. Of the 18 British crew who were on board HMS Peterel at the time of the attack, 6 of them were killed. Their bodies were never recovered, and they have no known grave. The 12 remaining Royal Navy crewmen, mostly injured, survived and were taken prisoner. The fate of the 19 locally recruited Chinese crewmen is unknown, although the silence about their fate is rather ominous. 3 British crewmen were ashore during the Japanese attack. 2 of them surrendered soon afterwards, but the 3rd was to evade capture, hiding out in Shanghai for the next 3.5 years until the very end of the war. Chief Petty Officer James Cumming from Sheffield had joined the Royal Navy upon leaving school in 1930. Fortunately ashore, when the Peterel was attacked, he was hidden by members of the White Russian community in the city. Operating under the nom de guerre Mr. Trees, he joined a Chinese-American spy ring, sending intelligence to the Allies and providing a clandestine link between both POW and civilian internment camps and the outside world. Despite being a wanted man, Cumming was able to stay one step ahead of the Japanese intelligence for the entire war. He married a Russian woman from that White Russian community, Mila, and they had a daughter. At the end of the war, Cumming left the Navy, returning to his native Sheffield with his wife and daughter, where he worked for a burglar alarm company until he died in 1973. The 12 surviving crew members, including Lieutenant Polkinghorn, became prisoners of war, where 2 of them died in the harsh conditions. Upon his liberation at the end of the war in 1945, Lieutenant Stephen Polkinghorn was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the DSC, for his actions in Shanghai in December 1941. He returned to New Zealand and lived to the remarkable age of 97, dying in Auckland in the early 1980s. Able seaman James Mariner, the man credited with firing the very first shots against the Japanese, survived both the sinking and Japanese captivity. After the war, he returned to Britain, where he served as a policeman for 28 years in Dorset. He died in Bournemouth in 2009 at the grand old age of 90. With the bombardment still echoing across the water, Japanese troops stormed into the international settlement. They met no resistance. 8,000 European civilians from Shanghai would be removed to internment camps, including the young J.G. Ballard, whose experiences would later inspire Empire of the Sun, filmed by Steven Spielberg in 1987. Incredibly, the only Europeans who were not interred en masse were the 20,000 Jews who'd fled Nazi Germany. In one of those twists of history, because they carried German exit passports, even though they were stamped with the infamous J for Jews, the Japanese viewed them as citizens of their wartime ally and did not intern them. Whilst confined to a ghetto, they survived the war in squalid but largely unmolested conditions. The century-long era of Western privilege in Shanghai was over. It would never return. With an eye on wartime alliances and the hoped-for post-war world, in 1943 both Great Britain and the USA signed treaties with the Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek, relinquishing their extraterritorial rights in China. At the end of the war, the international settlement was simply absorbed into the rest of Shanghai. The grand European buildings on the Bund and the houses nearby still remain, relics of a different age in history. The loss of HMS Peterel is a mere footnote in the huge war that engulfed Asia and the Pacific. The British losses of Singapore, Hong Kong and the sinking of the warships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse made the loss of 6 men on an almost defenceless vessel against overwhelming odds in Shanghai almost invisible. And yet, in many ways, it sums up the British character: stubborn, bloody-minded and defiant even when the chips are down. And even though it was a futile gesture, she nevertheless went down fighting with her white ensign still flying. Sometimes it's defeats as much as victories that show a national character. Oh, I've gone down several rabbit holes whilst researching this episode, and it's prompted me to consider telling some more stories, such as the history of the international settlement in Shanghai itself, The actions of the ever-victorious army during the 19th century, Taiping Rebellion under Frederick Townsend Ward, and Charles Chinese Gordon, later Gordon of Khartoum. And maybe the Opium Wars need a retelling too. What do you think? Drop me a line. And don't forget to check out the description below to find out how you can support my channel. A big thanks to Dale, Vince and Stacey for already doing so. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.